Hello and welcome. Asterisk, the chilling clang of metal on stone echoed through the night, a discordant symphony of impending doom. Inside the great keep, the flickering light of a single tallow candle cast dancing, grotesque shadows across the face of Alara, a young woman whose hands, roughened by a life of labor, now trembled as she clutched a small wooden doll to her breast. The air in the stone chamber was thick with the scent of fear, damp straw, and the metallic temps of unwashed bodies. Outside, the distant thud of a battering ram against the outer walls sent vibrations through the very bedrock, a relentless heartbeat against their fading hope. This was the first dawn of a siege, and already the fortress, once a symbol of impregnable might, felt like a coffin. Before the siege, life within these walls had been a predictable tapestry woven from duty and tradition. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer had sounded with purposeful rhythm. The scent of fresh-baked bread from the kitchens had wafted through the courtyards, and the murmur of children's games had filled the air. Lord Caelan, his face now grim and unyielding, had presided over a small but proud domain, his knights clad in burnished steel, their loyalty forged in years of shared hunts and occasional skirmishes. Now, the ordinary sounds of life had been replaced by the chilling cacophony of war. Every creak of the old timbers, every gust of wind through the arrow slits seemed to whisper of imminent breach. The faces of the defenders, once full of a stubborn pride, were now drawn and pale, their eyes fixed on the distant, silent enemy encampment. The initial assaults had been relentless. Waves of soldiers, like ravenous wolves, had surged against the stone, their scaling ladders scraping against the rough masonry, their battle cries tearing at the sanity of those within. Flaming arrows, trailing ribbons of smoke, had arced over the walls, seeking out the vulnerable thatched roofs and timber structures within the castle grounds. The air had grown thick with the acrid scent of burning pitch and the metallic temps of blood. Alara had watched from the inner bailey, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, as figures fell from the battlements, silent against the roar of the assault. The constant thudding impact of the battering ram against the main gate was a physical torment, a relentless reminder of the thin barrier between them and utter annihilation. Each blow resonated through the stone, shaking the very bones of the ancient fortress, a rhythmic drumbeat counting down their last hours. The true siege, however, began not with a battering ram, but with the gnawing pang of hunger. The invaders had settled in, their encampment a dark stain upon the distant hills, patiently waiting. Days bled into weeks, and the once abundant stores within the keep began to dwindle. The taste of fresh meat became a distant memory, replaced by coarse, mouldy bread and thin, tasteless gruel. The scent of cooking fires, once a symbol of warmth and sustenance, now barely rose from the kitchens. Soldiers, once robust and vital, moved with a slower, more deliberate gait, their armor feeling heavier with each passing hour. The children, their bellies distended, their laughter replaced by weak whimpers, became terrifying reflections of their dwindling hope. Lord Caelan himself, his once firm jaw now slack with exhaustion, would pace the battlements, his eyes scanning the horizon for a relief force that never came. The cold fog, thick and pervasive, often rolled in from the river, clinging to the castle walls, a chilling metaphor for the despair that threatened to consume them. It obscured the enemy, but it also masked any hope of rescue. He could hear the low murmurs of discontent among his men, their loyalty fraying under the relentless assault of starvation. The once unshakable bonds of comradeship, forged in battle, were now tested by the primal pangs of the empty gut. The castle, once a symbol of safety, became a suffocating prison. Alara would press her ear against the cold, rough stone walls of her chamber, listening to the agonizing silence, broken only by the whimpers of her younger brother and the distant, mournful cries of starving birds circling above the castle. Each cry was a haunting reminder of the world outside, a world they could no longer reach. Her hands, once busy with the familiar tasks of weaving and tending the few remaining chickens, were now idle, useless against the siege. The very air seemed to grow heavier, thick with unspoken questions. How long, how much more could they endure? The last meager candles melted away, plunging their small chamber into a deeper gloom, reflecting the encroaching darkness of their future. The castle, their last refuge, felt less like a haven and more like a final, desperate trap, its doomed walls echoing with the unspoken fears of all trapped within. The cold, unyielding stone seemed to whisper the chilling truth that sometimes courage and strong walls were not enough against the relentless slow death brought by hunger. The acrid scent of smoke, mingling with the pervasive reek of sweat and fear, hung heavy in the stifling air of the inner courtyard. Above, the rhythmic clang of a battering ram striking the main gate sent bone-jarring tremors through the very foundations of the keep. Sir Gareth, his face grimed with soot and exhaustion, stood shoulder to shoulder with his wary men, their armor dented, their eyes burning with a desperate defiance. The stone of the gatehouse, scarred by countless blows, seemed to groan under the assault, a living thing pushed to its breaking point. This was the raw, brutal heart of a siege, where every moment felt like a desperate gamble against the inevitable. Days before, the castle had been a bustling hub of life. The blacksmith's forge had pulsed with warmth. The scent of horse and leather had filled the stables, and the distant call of the falconer had echoed across the peaceful domain. But now the besieging army, a dark tide of banners and men, had surrounded them, cutting off all avenues of escape, all hope of relief. Their campfires twinkled like malevolent stars in the endless night, a constant, mocking reminder of their inescapable trap. The defenders, once accustomed to the familiar comforts of a well-stocked fortress, now found themselves prisoners within their own walls, their eyes perpetually scanning the horizon for a relief force that remained a phantom hope. The first waves of attack had been a storm of steel and fire. Scaling ladders, like skeletal fingers, had reached for the battlements, only to be met by a hail of rocks, boiling water, and the sharp bite of arrows. The air had been thick with the cries of the wounded and the dying, both friend and foe. Sir Gareth had fought like a man possessed, his sword a blur of silver, his heavy shield deflecting blow after blow. But the relentless pressure, the sheer numbers of the enemy, was a tide that threatened to overwhelm even the bravest. The clang of the ram, ceaseless and unforgiving, was a drumbeat of doom, hammering not just at the gate, but at the very sanity of the defenders. Beyond the physical assault, a more insidious enemy began its work. The dwindling water supply, contaminated by the enemy's desperate attempts, became a source of widespread disease. A hacking cough, once isolated, spread like wildfire through the cramped quarters. The smell of fevered bodies and unwashed linen permeated the castle, a sickening sweetness that clung to every breath. Men who had fought bravely now lay writhing in agony, their strength ebbing with each passing hour. The healers, their faces grim under their cowls, moved tirelessly through the suffering, their herbal remedies often proving futile against the relentless grip of the sickness. The very stones of the castle, once a symbol of protection, now felt like the walls of a vast, inescapable infirmary. The once sacred chambers, usually reserved for prayer or quiet contemplation, were transformed into makeshift wards, filled with the moans of the suffering. The vibrant banners that once adorned the walls now seemed to mock the pallor of the dying. Sir Gareth, walking through the torchlit halls, could feel the profound despair settling upon his men, a heavier burden than any armor. The sight of a young soldier, once strong and vibrant, now reduced to a feverish trembling shadow, was a brutal reminder of the enemy within. The rhythmic clang of the battering ram, no longer just a physical threat, took on a deeper, more terrifying meaning. It was the sound of their very will being slowly hammered into dust, as the moon, a pale sliver in the smoke-filled sky, cast long, ghostly shadows across the inner courtyard. A young boy, perhaps a scullery lad, lay shivering, clutching a small, mud-stained wooden toy horse. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at the rough, cold stone ceiling, reflecting the flickering torchlight that danced across the grime. His ragged breath hitched, a faint, struggling whisper in the overwhelming silence of the castle's despair. He was not yet old enough to understand the full horror of a siege, but his small body knew the cold gnawing of hunger and the oppressive weight of fear. His stillness, amidst the unseen suffering, was a testament to a spirit slowly fading, a subtle, heartbreaking end that spoke louder than any battle cry. The doomed walls around him echoed not with the roar of war, but with the quiet, pervasive hum of human suffering, a silent prophecy of their inevitable fall. The air in the great hall, once alive with the boisterous laughter of knights and the clatter of servants, now felt heavy and still, thick with the scent of damp wool and dwindling hope. Lady Isolde, her embroidered gown now stained and torn, knelt beside her younger son, his breath a shallow rasp against the chilling damp of the stone walls. Outside, the relentless snowfall, thick and silent, blanketed the land, erasing all signs of the besieging army, yet trapping those within with an iron grip far more insidious than any siege engine. This was a siege not of steel and fire, but of ice and attrition, a slow, agonizing descent into oblivion where the enemy was the very season itself. Before the snow, the castle had prepared. Granaries were filled, firewood stacked high, and the garrison stood ready for any assault. They had faced sieges before, battles of strength and courage, but this was different. The first flakes of snow had been a beautiful sight, a soft blanket covering the scars of war. No one had foreseen that it would fall relentlessly for weeks on end, burying their supply lines, freezing their wells, and making any hope of relief utterly impossible. The distant bells of the village church, normally a comforting sound, had long since fallen silent. Buried under the drifts, a symbol of a world cut off, the true siege began with the hunger. The grain, once plentiful, dwindled with terrifying speed. The livestock, kept in the lower levels of the castle, shivered and succumbed to the cold, their emaciated forms offering little sustenance. The smell of desperate, meager, cooking thin gruel, roasted rats, scavenged roots, replaced the rich aroma of feasts. Soldiers, once formidable in their polished armor, now moved like gaunt specters, their faces hollow, their strength ebbing with each passing, starving day. The cheerful songs once sung by the hearth were replaced by hushed whispers, tales of desperate measures taken in other besieged castles, stories of mothers sacrificing their own lives for their children, or worse, Lady Isolde, whose hands once embroidered delicate tapestries, now scraped the last remnants of flour from a wooden bin, her nails cracked and raw. The children, their small bodies shivering despite the layers of rough fabric, sat quietly, their eyes wide with a hunger they could not comprehend. The bitter cold permeated everything, seeping into their bones, chilling their very souls. Even the grand chapel, usually a source of comfort, felt bleak and empty, its icons seeming to stare with silent indifference at their suffering. The light from the few remaining candles flickered weakly, unable to push back the profound gloom that settled upon them. A metaphor for their dwindling hope. One could almost feel the profound isolation, the terrible knowledge that no help would come. The whispers of despair grew into a chilling murmur amongst the garrison talk, of surrender, of breaking out, of dying with dignity. But surrender meant certain death for the nobility, and a breakout meant walking into a frozen, unforgiving wilderness. The choice was a torment. Lord Reginald, Isolde's husband, once a pillar of strength, sat by the cold hearth, his face buried in his hands, the weight of his starving people a crushing burden. His armored gauntlets, once symbols of his might, now lay discarded, cold and useless, beside him. The grieving mother archetype, embodied in Lady Isolde, now held her youngest son, his small body growing colder, smaller, with each agonizing breath. His face, once plump with childhood innocence, was now sharp and pale, his lips blue. The chill of his skin was the true cold of the winter, seeping into her heart. Her silent tears, frozen on her cheeks, were the only water left to give. The castle, her sanctuary, her home, had become a freezing tomb, its doomed walls sealing their fate, revealing the brutal truth that sometimes the elements themselves could be the most implacable and terrifying of foes. The endless snowfall continued its silent descent, slowly burying their last breaths beneath a shroud of white, the rhythmic thud of a battering ram. Resonating through the very foundations of the keep was a ceaseless, brutal pulse against the defenders' fading hope. Sir Callan, his face grimed with soot and exhaustion, clung to the cold stone of the parapet, his eyes scanning the fog-drenched landscape beyond the outer wall. A chilling mist, thick and pervasive, clung to the distant, menacing shapes of siege, engines and human figures blurring the line between enemy and phantom. The air tasted of wet stone, fear, and the metallic tang of impending violence. This was not merely a siege. It was a desperate, unyielding embrace of annihilation, where every moment was a struggle for breath against the crushing weight of inevitable. Doomed out days before, the castle had stood proud and defiant, its banners snapping in the wind, its garrison well-fed and ready. The sounds of daily life, the distant lowing of cattle, the chatter of the market in the bailey, the clatter of plates in the great hall had filled the air. But then the enemy had arrived, a dark tide engulfing their world. The first assaults had been a whirlwind of arrows and flung stones, testing the strength of their doomed walls. Each impact against the stone sent tremors through the defenders, a physical manifestation of the relentless pressure. The raw fear, a cold knot in the gut, began to spread, slowly eroding the morale of even the stoutest knights. Now the battle had shifted. The enemy, wise to the castle's strength, had settled into a grim patience, aiming not for a quick breach, but a slow, agonizing surrender. The supply routes were cut, the surrounding countryside scorched, leaving no hope of relief. Starvation began its insidious work. The once plentiful stores of salted meat and dried grains dwindled to nothing, replaced by the gnawing ache in their bellies. The scent of hunger became a pervasive odor, clinging to their clothes, to their very breath. Soldiers, once stalwart and formidable, moved with a shuffling, weakened gait, their armor feeling like an unbearable weight. Even the youngest children, their small bodies wasting, cried not for toys, but for a crust of bread, their pleas a constant, heartbreaking soundtrack to their slow demise. Lord Alaric, the Castellan, his eyes sunken and bloodshot, would pace the battlements, a gaunt shadow against the swirling fog. His once authoritative voice was now a mere rasp, his pronouncements of continued resistance growing hollow against the mounting despair. He could feel the growing desperation among his men, the silent accusations in their eyes, the desperate pleas for an end to their suffering. The thought of surrender, once unthinkable, now preyed on his mind like a ravenous beast, promising an end to the agony, but at the cost of his honor, his oath, his very soul. He watched as his men, once proud warriors, began to collapse from weakness, their bodies giving out against the relentless, unseen enemy of hunger. Amidst the growing despair, a chilling rumor began to spread that the enemy, in their cruel ingenuity, had begun to hurl not just stones, but diseased carcasses over the walls. The sickening stench of rotting flesh, carried on the damp air, now mingled with the acrid smell of their own despair. A new terror, unseen and insidious, began its work. The symptoms appeared first in the weakest, a sudden fever, a hacking cough, dark blotches appearing on their skin. The castle, once a stronghold, transformed into a festering trap, its cramped conditions and dwindling sanitation turning it into a perfect breeding ground for the plague. The moans of the sick, once confined to the makeshift infirmary, now echoed through every corridor, every chamber, a terrifying symphony of death. The castle walls, their rough stone, once a symbol of protection, now felt like the cold, unyielding boundaries of a shared tomb. Lady Isolde, her face a mask of profound sorrow, watched as her youngest child, his breath a faint whisper, succumbed to the unseen contagion. She knelt there, her hands raw from frantic prayer, the candlelight in the draughty chamber casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance with the spirits of the dying. The silence that followed her child's last breath was not merely the absence of sound, but the resounding, horrifying echo of a civilization's desperate, losing battle against forces both seen and unseen. The doomed walls that promised protection had become their cage, revealing the brutal truth that even the mightiest fortresses could not withstand the combined assault of famine and pestilence. The oppressive gloom of the great hall was broken only by the flickering glow of a single, guttering candle, its weak light illuminating the anxious faces of the castle's remaining inhabitants. The air was thick with the scent of fear, stale sweat, and the damp chill of stone. Outside, the rhythmic thud of a battering ram against the outer gate seemed to echo the desperate beating of their hearts, each impact a physical blow against their fragile hope. Lord Eamon, his face grimed with soot and exhaustion, gripped the hilt of his sword, his eyes fixed on the massive timbers of the inner gate, knowing it was only a matter of time. Days ago, the castle had been a bustling microcosm of life. The clatter of armor, the shouts of the training yard, the hearty smells from the kitchens, all had spoken of strength and vitality. But now, the enemy had settled in for a long, grinding siege, their vast encampment a dark stain on the horizon, slowly strangling the life from within the walls. The initial furious assaults had battered their defenses, but it was the insidious work of starvation that truly began to break their spirit. The grain stores dwindled, the last of the salted meat was consumed, and the faces of the garrison, once strong and resolute, grew hollow and gaunt, their movements slow and deliberate. The constant gnawing of hunger was a torment more profound than any blow. Men who had faced down fierce warriors now wept for a crust of bread. The children, their small bodies wasting, cried not for toys, but for a mouthful of gruel. The very sounds of the castle had changed, the boisterous laughter replaced by the soft, ragged breaths of the starving, the clatter of daily life replaced by the pervasive, aching silence of desperation. Lord Eamon could feel the morale of his men eroding, not with a sudden crack, but with a slow, agonizing weariness. The most terrifying weapon of the besiegers, however, was not the ram, but the insidious disease that crept within the walls. Carcasses of diseased animals, flung over the battlements by the enemy's trebuchets, landed with sickening thuds in the outer bailey, spreading their contagion. A terrible plague, with its characteristic dark blotches and agonizing fevers, began to take hold. The scent of sickness, a sickly sweet odor of decay, mingled with the pervasive stench of unwashed bodies and dwindling sanitation. The castle, once a bastion of safety, became a festering trap, its crowded conditions a perfect breeding ground for death. The makeshift infirmary, set up in the grand hall, was now a constant scene of suffering. The moans of the fevered filled the air, punctuated by the chilling silence of those who had succumbed. The healers, their faces grim and weary beneath their hoods, moved tirelessly, their herbal remedies often proving futile against the relentless grip of the sickness. Lord Eamon walked amongst them, his heart a cold, leaden weight in his chest, witnessing the slow demise of his people. The sight of a once strong knight, now reduced to a shivering, delirious shadow, was a brutal reminder of their powerlessness, as the sun, a cold, indifferent eye, began to set, painting the sky in hues of blood and ash. A young, barefoot child lay shivering on a bed of straw in a dark corner of the castle hall. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at the rough, cold stone ceiling, reflecting the flickering candlelight that danced across the grime. Her ragged breath hitched, a faint, struggling whisper in the overwhelming silence of the castle's despair. She was not yet old enough to understand the full horror of a siege, but her small body knew the cold gnawing of hunger and the oppressive weight of fear. Her stillness, amidst the unseen suffering, was a testament to a spirit slowly fading, a subtle, heart-breaking end that spoke louder than any battle cry. The doomed walls around her echoed not with the roar of war, but with the quiet, pervasive hum of human suffering, a silent prophecy of their inevitable fall. The relentless drumming of rain against the castle walls, a ceaseless rhythm of despair, matched the frantic pounding of fear in the hearts of those trapped within. Lord Brian, his face grim and unshaven, paced the draughty, cold stone corridors, the heavy scent of wet wool and unwashed bodies clinging to the air. Outside, the sounds of the siege, the distant rumble of trebuchets, the shouts of the besieged army, the metallic clang of picks against stone, were magnified by the acoustics of the rain-drenched night, pressing in on the very sanity of the defenders. This was a siege of attrition, not just of physical resources, but of the very will to endure. Days before, a sense of grim determination had filled the keep. They had seen the besieging army arrive, a dark tide engulfing their lands, and had prepared for a direct assault. But the enemy had chosen a different path, settling in for a long, grinding wait, cutting off all supply lines, turning the castle from a fortress into a cage. The initial flurry of activity, the readying of boiling oil, the sharpening of arrows, the patrolling of the battlements, had given way to a quiet, pervasive desperation. The sight of the besiegers' vast campfires, twinkling like malevolent stars in the endless night, was a constant, mocking reminder of their inescapable trap. The first true enemy was the starvation. The meticulously inventoried grain stores dwindled to mere handfuls. The last of the salted meat became a distant memory. The soldiers, once robust and vital, moved with a slow, deliberate gait, their armor feeling like an unbearable weight against their weakening frames. The scent of hunger became a pervasive odor, clinging to their clothes, to their very breath. Children, their bellies distended, their laughter replaced by weak whimpers, became terrifying reflections of their dwindling hope, their pleas for a crust of bread a constant, heartbreaking soundtrack to their slow demise. Then the plague arrived, an insidious enemy that cared nothing for walls or defenses. It crept in, perhaps on a rat, perhaps on the clothes of a desperate messenger, and spread with terrifying speed through the cramped, unsanitary conditions of the besieged castle. The sick lay on beds of damp straw, their skin mottled with dark blotches, their cries of agony echoing through the once proud halls. The scent of sickness, a sickly sweet odor of decay, mingled with the pervasive reek of unwashed bodies and the dampness of the stone. The healers, their faces grim under their cowls, moved tirelessly, their herbal remedies often proving futile against the relentless grip of the contagion. Lord Brian, his own body weakened by hunger, watched in numb despair as his garrison, once proud and defiant, was systematically consumed by both famine and disease. The sight of a seasoned knight, his eyes vacant with delirium, succumbing to the fever, was a testament to their utter powerlessness. The very air seemed to grow heavier, thick with unspoken questions. How long, how much more could they endure? His loyalty to his oath, to his king, was tested by the cries of his dying men, the once sacred symbols of his authority, his sword. His ring now felt like hollow mockeries against the overwhelming reality of their doom. As the moon, a pale sliver in the smoke-filled sky, cast long, ghostly shadows across the inner courtyard, a young boy, perhaps a scullery lad, lay shivering, clutching a small, mud-stained wooden toy horse. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at the rough, cold stone ceiling, reflecting the flickering torchlight that danced across the grime. His ragged breath hitched, a faint, struggling whisper in the overwhelming silence of the castle's despair. He was not yet old enough to understand the full horror of a siege, but his small body knew the cold gnawing of hunger and the oppressive weight of fear. His stillness, amidst the unseen suffering, was a testament to a spirit slowly fading, a subtle, heartbreaking end that spoke louder than any battle cry. The doomed walls around him echoed not with the roar of war, but with the quiet, pervasive hum of human suffering, a silent prophecy of their inevitable fall. The crushing weight of silence settled over the great hall, broken only by the rasp of shallow breaths and the distant, mournful creak of dying timbers. Lord Eamon, his face a mask of profound sorrow, moved among his skeletal garrison, their forms hunched and defeated against the damp, cold stone walls. The air, thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and the metallic temps of despair, felt heavy with the unspoken truth. The castle, their last bastion, was dying from within. Outside, the enemy remained unseen, a patient, implacable shadow. Their siege, a testament not to brute force, but to a chillingly effective strategy of attrition days ago. The castle had been a symphony of life, the clatter of weapons, the shouts of the training yard, the rhythmic hum of daily chores. They had prepared for a swift, brutal assault, steel against steel. But the enemy had opted for the slow strangulation, sealing off the fortress, turning it into an inescapable cage. The grand banners that once adorned the walls now hung limp and lifeless, their vibrant colors dulled by the pervasive gloom. The very stone, once a symbol of impregnable might, now felt like the cold, unyielding boundaries of a shared tomb. Amplifying every cough, every desperate sigh, the first enemy to arrive was hunger. The initial rationing, meant to extend their stores, soon became a desperate scramble for mere sustenance. The grain, once plentiful, dwindled to dust, the last salted meat consumed with a grim reverence. Soldiers, once robust and vital, moved like wraiths, their armor feeling like an unbearable weight against their wasting frames. The children's laughter had vanished, replaced by the persistent, soft whimpers of starvation. The pervasive scent of desperation, a bitter, metallic odor, clung to their clothes, to their very breath. The once sacred act of breaking bread now involved sharing a few meager crumbs, an agonizing ritual of shared suffering. Then came the disease, an unseen killer more terrifying than any army. It began with a cough, a fever, then the telltale dark blotches on the skin. The plague, insidious and relentless, spread like wildfire through the cramped quarters, fueled by poor sanitation and weakened bodies. The castle, once a symbol of health, became a festering trap, its crowded conditions a breeding ground for death. The sounds of moaning and retching replaced the former bustle, a horrifying symphony of suffering that echoed through every corridor. The healers, their faces grim beneath their beaked masks, moved tirelessly, their herbal remedies proving futile against the relentless grip of the contagion. Lord Aemon, his own body weakened by hunger and the chilling proximity of death, watched in numb despair as his garrison, once proud and defiant, was systematically consumed. The sight of a beloved knight, once a bastion of strength, now reduced to a shivering, delirious shadow, was a testament to their utter powerlessness. The very air seemed to grow heavier, thick with unspoken questions. How much more? How long until they too succumbed? His loyalty to his oath, to his king, was tested by the cries of his dying men, by the chilling reality that his leadership could not stave off this invisible foe, as the last glimmer of torchlight sputtered and died in the grand hall, casting deep, consuming shadows across the faces of the dying. A young grieving mother, her face streaked with tears and grime, clutched a small, lifeless bundle wrapped in a tattered cloth. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at the rough, cold stone ceiling, reflecting the profound sorrow that filled the chamber. Her silent sobs were the only sound, a raw testament to the human spirit's breaking point. Her stillness, amidst the unseen suffering, was a heartbreaking end that spoke louder than any battle cry. The doomed walls around her echoed not with the roar of war, but with the quiet, pervasive hum of human suffering, a silent prophecy of their inevitable fall. The cold, unyielding stone seemed to whisper the chilling truth that sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with swords, but with breath against the suffocating embrace of disease and despair.